Hello, everyone. On today's show, I am pleased to welcome the founder of the social media accounts and media hub called Fiat Money. They're on X, Instagram, and YouTube. Please, Fiat Money founder, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you for coming on again. I appreciate it. And I guess what I want to do here to set the steam for the show is kind of talk about how we first got engaged on social media on X. I originally had posted a tweet that was talking about Bitcoin. The tweet was originally a post saying that the U.S. national debt was over $37 trillion, and I quoted it and said Bitcoin, ... You responded to me with a post that said why ... and underneath it was a picture of a graph that said the higher the deficit, the more growth. Pretty obvious once you remember that government deficits equal private sector surpluses. What do you mean by that? And why don't we dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think the simplest mental model to understand this is actually the game of Monopoly.
Okay.
Think about the game of Monopoly and what does the banker do and what kind of powers does he have? So actually the rules of the game say that the banker in Monopoly cannot go bankrupt. If he runs out of physical cash, he can just print more cash. That's what the rules of the game say. And then let's think about the math of spending deficits and surpluses on the board. If I told you that after a round, banker has in his cash stash $7 less, how many dollars more or less do the players have? They have $7 more, right? So when the banker spends into the board, whoever gets it, when he has a deficit, the board has a surplus. So when I count the players' money and they grow their money accounts, it means that the banker runs down his account. So it's actually a mathematical truth and identity that the banker's deficit is the player's surplus.
Okay, so I guess I would want to push back a little bit there. And, in Monopoly, is the banker creating that money out of thin air? Is the banker just losing money and running a deficit? Or is he printing that money to give out to other players?
I think the easiest way to think about this is what if we played it on a computer, right?
Okay.
You would literally have something like an Excel spreadsheet where he would award players certain sums. And he doesn't even have, if I give you a number on a spreadsheet, did I lose any numbers? Did my powers to create future numbers diminish in any way? No, right? So actually, the crazy thing is for us, money is scarce, right? We wake up thinking how we get more money, how we spend, how we earn more money, how do we avoid being bankrupt. The banker is actually an arbiter, not a player, right? He awards points to players. So I think, if you think about the electronic kind of platform of the game of Monopoly, he literally says, I gave this player $7, I gave this player $15, I gave $22 more than I took. So I have a deficit, but do I care? I don't care. I'm an arbiter. And the players, they care more. They care more because now their ability to spend is increased. And the question is, is it good? Is it bad? And here kind of the usefulness of this analogy to Monopoly kind of ends, right? Because in Monopoly, there is no production, there is no inflation.
Right.
But, in Monopoly, if you told me, hey, the rule should be that every round we worry about the banker's deficit, this doesn't sound right, right? Do we care about the banker's deficit? I've never played Monopoly when anybody would care about the banker's deficit or the banker running out of money. So we care more about the surpluses of the players. And then the question is, what do those surpluses do? Do they create inflation? What should the banker do? What should the rules of spending for the banker be? Obviously, we shouldn't make a rule that, okay, every time you cross start, you get $50,000, right? Then the game is stupid, boring, nobody goes bankrupt. In the real economy, it would be, okay, if we gave everybody $1 trillion, we have inflation, we didn't increase production, nobody's better off. So I think the whole theory is okay, the rules of players who can run out of money do not apply to the government. What should the rules be.
Okay, so then from there, I want to ask you, what do you say to the critics or the people that say, well, like these deficits, if we take a step back from the monopoly
Mhm.
analogy here, what do you say to the people or the critics that say, well, no, the government deficits are getting us further into debt, and that's not good because we're printing this money, which is causing inflation and hollowing out like working class and middle class people? Like, what do you say to that argument?
Yeah, it's a decent argument theoretically. That's exactly what we should be talking about, right? The banker cannot run out of money, so scratch bankruptcy and all this stuff.
Okay.
But the banker can give us too much money, right? So if you say, hey, that the deficit is so large and the debt is so large that it causes inflation, then yeah, it's a point that has to be checked. And how do we check it, right? So the question is, where does inflation come from? And everybody thinks, okay, the government creates inflation. If you look at the data, it's not as clear cut. It's not clear at all, actually, because there is the whole topic of the banking system.
Mm.
Banks create deposit out of thin air when they give you a loan, so that's a huge topic, and this actually shows that a lot of inflation comes from there.
Sure.
And then where would you expect inflation in an economy driven by too much money, right? You would expect it if so-called output gap, or how do you say it, like a usage of capacity, of productive capacity is like at the limit, then
Mhm.
you would expect inflation. But when we look at the output gap in the US economy and many other economies, it's still there. It means there is unused resources, like companies are using 80% of their productive capacity. There is still unemployed people. And inflation, for example, in this latest inflation scare, right, or episode, was mainly driven by supply factors. So I think the argument is valid. Yes, inflation may be a risk. That's exactly what we should be looking at. But
Yeah.
we are not doing it wrong yet.
Well, what are your ways to kind of mitigate that risk? Like, how can governments go about the size of the deficit they run in a more responsible way? And is that more in the hands of the government, the central bank, in terms of interest rates? Like, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, I think, a lot of people say that all the inflation is the fault of the central bank. And actually, the theory I'm kind of espousing says the opposite. It's actually, if you feel the government or the state is creating inflation, it would be the treasury. It would be the fiscal policy rather than monetary policy. Taxes and spending. So if you spend too much and you tax too little, you can get inflation. What does the Fed do? If you look at what the Fed can do, is literally only asset swaps. They cannot do so-called helicopter drops when they like print $1 trillion and they sprinkle on the economy. When they sprinkle $1 trillion, they take $1 trillion worth of almost identical assets. So the Fed actually is always at zero. Like the deficit of the Fed is zero. The deficit of the Treasury is $3 trillion a year. This is where the $3 trillion is coming to the monopoly board.
Right.
The Fed only does asset swaps and then it sets interest rates. So you
Yeah.
can say, hey, interest rates are too low. But again, in theory, interest rates are everything. In practice, if you look at the impact of interest rates, even on lending, it's very weak, very weak.
Okay.
They have some impact on mortgage lending. But for example, when you ask companies like CFOs, like, do you look at interest rates when you make investment decisions? Basically, their hurdle rates for decisions on investments are roughly order of, let's say, 12-20% return. So
Mhm.
whether interest rates are 2% or 4%, it's not going to move a needle for them. So, and they say exactly like, we don't look at the central bank interest rates. So
Okay, but what I want to say there too, then you say, it's more fiscal policy than it
yeah,
is monetary policy, more about tax and spending, less about what the central bank is doing with interest rates. However, I want to say then is, well, when you said, well, the Fed doesn't just print $1 trillion and sprinkle it into the economy, but over like the pandemic, like during COVID, like that's exactly what they did. They printed money and then the government sent it out in stimulus checks to individuals.
that's fiscal policy. Fiscal policy. I agree. But it
Okay,
was, go
but
ahead.
if we didn't have like a central bank, how do you mitigate that argument? If we didn't have a central bank, didn't have a vehicle to be able to print and spend that money, what do you think that scenario looks like? Do you think we'd still be able to do something like stimulus checks? Do you think we'd still have like that sort of inflation? Like, what do you think about that?
I mean, first of all, I think that the last inflation wasn't caused by by deficit spending, but let's say you think it was, right? What happened before the central bank existed, before 1913? Literally, the functions of today's central bank were done out of a unit within the Treasury Department. The
Okay.
Treasury Department then had the right to print greenbacks. So, what is the central bank? The central bank is really nothing much than a um, clearinghouse for bank liabilities. Like when we are on the East Coast, if you get a check from a San Francisco bank, before the central bank, nobody would accept this check at par on the East Coast, right? They would have
Mm.
to basically call some detective agency, PI, to check if this bank even exists. Like they would give you 80 cents on the dollar, so stuff like this.
Okay.
Now, basically, this bank in San Francisco is plugged into the Fed. Every other bank is plugged into the Fed. You drop this check at the East Coast bank, and the East Coast bank gives it to the Fed, and the Fed says, like, yeah, this bank exists, doesn't matter. So the Fed is basically saying, okay, like, really a clearinghouse, right? Before the Fed existed, Treasury would literally print dollars. And those dollars would be accepted because they have the right to tax. That's
Okay.
also what this theory says. Why would the stupid paper dollar be even accepted? Why would you work for monopoly dollars? These are monopoly dollars. They literally promise you nothing except that you won't go to jail if you show up with those dollars to pay your taxes. It's the only promise they give you. They will not say, hey, we don't recognize this piece of paper. They will say, no, we do. We do. You owe $100. You brought a $50 bill, and we change your tax obligation from 100 to 50.
Okay, but why did we need a central bank for all of this? Like, why couldn't we just do this out of the treasury, kind of like you mentioned? I guess I'm a little bit confused there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think we don't, right? The central bank is just removed as a unit of treasury, put aside and said, like, we'll make this unit independent. But to me, whether it's an independent central bank or a unit of treasury, it would work the same. The power
Mhm.
comes from the fact that the state has the power to levy taxes and thus has the power to issue money that is accepted. And without the central bank, they would do the same. They would literally do the same.
Yeah, well, that's always my argument for like, why do we need a Federal Reserve? Why do we need a central bank? And it's like, if you look back, why can't, like you just said, the Treasury handle this stuff? Because in my opinion, like if we're supposed to be living in a true free market economy, the idea of having 12 people sit in a room and try to centrally plan what interest rates would be and centrally plan what's going on in the economy seems ridiculous to me. And also the fact that, you talked about the independence. I mean, we all know that the Fed is not independent, and it really never has been. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's really heightened right now, and what's going on looks really bad and is really bad with the pressure that the president's putting on. But like even if you go back to like the 1960s and Lyndon Johnson was threatening the Fed chair then at, his Texas ranch, like there's stories of him pushing up against the wall and screaming in his face. Nixon did the same thing with Arthur Burns in the late 60s and 70s, wanting to keep interest rates low so that unemployment would stay low for his next reelection campaign. So it is true. It's like the Fed really is just another branch of the government, the Treasury. So it really is foolish that we try to like talk about the independence a little bit and the fact that we can't just manage this out of the federal government.
I mean, you have your, I think, libertarian perspective, right? I'm more on the left side, actually, and I think we agree here. But
Yep.
I don't view it as a problem. Like, to me, the Fed is the branch of the government.
Hmm.
It's an executive branch of the government, like the military, like the post office. They do stuff.
Right.
And it's complete smoke and mirrors that they're independent. They are not independent. They are
Yeah.
stuffed with, people from Wall Street.
Yep. Exactly.
And they have a lot more power, unfortunately, to help Wall Street than to help Main Street. For
Right.
example, during the housing bubble, a lot of people went underwater and a lot of banks went underwater. And if you go underwater, sometimes if you get loans for a long enough period, you are gonna survive. You don't need to liquidate your house at a loss, right?
Mhm.
Who got the loans? Banks got the loans. Did
Right.
homeowners got the loans? No, they didn't. So that's the problem. But I don't see, who should set interest rates. I think it's kind of impossible not to set interest rate by the state because what is an interest rate in the modern economy? It's literally the ratio of price of a bond to a dollar. Who sets the ratio of this price? The monopoly issuer of both dollars and bonds. This is as natural as, Apple setting the ratio of a price of an iPhone to an iPad. Apple has to do it.
Right.
They're monopoly supplier of iPads, so they set the price of an iPad.
But also to push back a little bit there, I would say that in a lot of ways, like the market actually, and if I was to make, I would say, yeah, I would have a libertarian streak. Sometimes I am a little bit more on the left, a little bit more on the right, depending on certain issues. But like right there, like the libertarian argument for interest rates would be, well, the market sets them. And that they do that through individual banks, depending on the risk of the loan they're giving out, and then how much individuals have in terms of savings, if they have a lot or they have a little, and that would dictate interest rates. And then on your analogy with Apple, I would say that the market sets the price for iPads and iPhones or just kind of tech like that. Because if the price for Apple that the company sets is way too high, individuals would say, well, it's just not worth it. I'll go buy the Samsung version or whatever. So do you think that that's a valid argument?
It's a valid argument. The problem is the government has the monopoly power to force you to use their iPad, right? They say taxes are only payable in dollars.
Mm.
And the thing is, like, I think what we also learned over history is somebody has to basically backstop banks because you have bank runs and they are super costly.
Right.
So, when a bank makes a loan, some people say it's cheating because, okay, this deposit comes out of nowhere. But in reality, if you get the loan from a bank, let's say you borrow to buy a car, right? You
Right.
sign your obligation to pay back $40,000, and the bank, out of nothing, credits your account with $40,000. So
Right.
they have the same amount of assets and liabilities. They created assets and liabilities, and you created assets and liabilities. So it's not cheating. The problem is that those assets for the bank, they are super illiquid. They kind of cannot sell it to anybody. It's your promise to pay it off.
Hmm.
And this promise is super liquid. They can try to sell it to another bank, but the bank says like, we didn't screen this client, so we'll pay you $38,000 for it, not 40, and so on and so on. So we learned in history that, they have immediate liability, right? The demand deposits. When people run on a bank, they say, hey, give me the $40,000 now in cash,
Right.
in US cash. They don't have the US cash. They only have your super illiquid promise to pay it off like at some future date. So the Fed or the government, if the Fed is within the treasury, basically says, okay, this bank has a decent book, has loans worth of $1 trillion and has deposit worth of $1 trillion. They shouldn't be bankrupt. We're gonna lend to them. So I think it's not a problem that the Fed or the state helps prevent bank runs. I think it's good. It's useful. Now, so they having this instrument of money and bonds, they have to set the relative price, but the private sector still has the right to say, although I can borrow from the government at, let's say, 1%, I still
Hmm.
charge you 3% for the loan. So it's not like, okay, FOMC sets all their interest rates in the economy. They only set this government interest rate and the private sector can charge more. The thing is that if they have the right for unlimited borrowings from the Fed at 1%, it's true that their own loan rates, it's not going to be 20%. It's going to be much lower, right? So
Right.
FOMC has a gigantic influence, but it's not like the private sector has no say.
No, I understand what you're saying for sure. However, I want to push back to you, and I'm just playing devil's advocate a little
Yeah, go
bit
ahead.
here. I want to hear your thoughts on this. So, you kind of mentioned, history has shown us, but I want to say, well, if you're looking at history, ever since we've had a central bank, right, a lender of last resort, because you talked about bank runs
Hmm.
before having a central bank, and kind of that was the idea to maybe stabilize the
Yep.
financial system. The two worst recessions or depressions of history have come during the time of a central bank with the Great Depression and the housing crisis, the Great Recession 2008. So what do you have to say to someone that says, well, really the Federal Reserve hasn't done anything, has only fueled the fire for these major recessions and depressions?
I mean, I disagree, but I think they did make mistakes with the second one, right? With the Great Recession. And in the first Great Depression, to be honest, I think they were kind of too new and we didn't understand how much the private debt matters, right? So, and I also disagree that, those were the worst depressions. If you look at the history of economic growth and inflation deflation, the 19th century was crazy. Like, on average, it had low inflation on average, but the inflation was like all over the place. It was literally like from 15% to minus 5%, frequent depressions, frequent bank failures, and so on and so on. So I do feel like we have learned to stabilize. At the same time, you can do it very poorly. For example, in the Great Recession, I think they had the right to basically liquidate the bad banks to teach them a lesson and still stabilize the rest of the banking sector.
During
We
2008.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we have the power now to say we can let the bad actors fail and stabilize the rest of the banking sector. They didn't let the bad actors fail. That's a problem.
Oh yeah, a major problem. And that's part of the problem I have with kind of like the Fed and the government. It's like all the little guys got screwed
Yeah.
during 2008. All the small community banks that went belly up. You know what happened to them? They didn't get bank bailouts with, TARP loans. They got freaking acquired by these massive banks that became even bigger and they got bailed out. So that's a problem I have with something like the Fed and something like the government that's, connected to Wall Street making all these moves. Like that's ridiculous to me.
Agree. And I think the response should be education because I think what the mainstream economics completely missed is that okay, the Fed lends to the banking sector, right? It
Hmm.
lends at the rate it sets. Nobody was monitoring the debt of the private sector. We have been hearing about the public debt for decades.
Yeah.
And when you look at the graph of public debt, it was almost a constant when, like versus GDP as a percentage of GDP, almost flat. In that time, private sector debt was skyrocketing. And none of the mainstream economists was even talking about this. So when you have like over leveraged private sector and the Fed is just like, doesn't look at his balance sheet like just lend, lend, lend. All the banks are making loans and they are making loans to, crazy, crazy projects, homeowners who cannot really afford any payments unless the housing prices go up and they can, hope to sell them in the future.
Hmm.
Nobody was monitoring this. I feel like from my perspective, it's good that we have a central bank. It's good that we can stop bank runs, but you have to monitor private debt. And unfortunately, you should also be regulating. Somebody can say it's a big government, big state, but I feel like there is very different loans to be had and to be made, right? You can make loans to productive investments. Somebody wants to build a chip factory, an Apple factory. That's a new stuff. Or build a new house. It's new. It
Right.
actually lowers inflation if you lend for that. But if you just lend to, like just make a hot potato of housing prices in existing housing stock, you just get a bubble. And then, yeah, like a lot of people make a lot of money giving those loans. And then you have to either bail them out or look at the economy crumble. So I would say this system can be fixed by knowledge. It's not like we should go back to bank runs and, take the Fed out of the economy. I don't feel so.
Okay. And so when you talk about private sector debt, you mean like the movie The Big Short, right? Have you seen that movie?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, like, when all those banks are giving out insane, like, loans to people that aren't qualified for them, like, for example, I always think of the one scene of when I can't remember, Steve Carell's at the strip club and the girl's like, "I have 3 houses,"
Yeah.
and all that, and he's like he calls it like, "They're the bubble," you know? And so that's what I think of too, but again, like, I'll come back to maybe a little bit of a government argument where it's like, yeah, there was a lot of private debt at the time, but one, would banks be able to loan this money out with such risk if they didn't have the knowledge or security of being bailed out by a Federal Reserve if something bad happened and their bank went under? And two, it's like, where are government regulators when all this private debt was occurring? Because the banking sector, as you know, is one of the most regulated industries in the country. Where was the government that's supposed to be overseeing these banks in the Federal Reserve? What were they doing? Like, they were asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, who was at the Fed at the time? This
Who
was
was it? Hank Paul? Or no, it
Alan
was
Greenspan,
Alan Greenspan. Yep.
who basically believed that the market regulates itself, and the best government is who regulates the least. That's a
But
problem.
also, Alan Greenspan was, like, full of crap a little bit. I mean, he was, and this is kind of something we'll switch to next, but continue on. I'll that's a changing the topic, but you continue.
Yeah, I think we agree. I feel like yes, they didn't regulate, and yes, they should have let a lot more banks fail while
Mhm.
stabilizing the rest of the banking sector. And we should have had stimulus the size of the coronavirus stimulus at the time to help Main Street. Main Street should be held before Wall Street. All those guys should be, let to fail. So, like, I think we mostly agree, but I still disagree that, okay, without the Fed, there is also a lot of like those firms are huge, right? Banks are
Mhm.
huge. There's this principal agent problem within every economic or financial firm. It's not like those guys knew that they were gonna get bailed out. I
Right.
think shareholders didn't even know exactly what the banks are doing, and a lot of the management didn't understand fully that this only works because it's a bubble. They just saw a bunch of numbers go up. We make a ton of loans. People don't default on those loans. People, if they qualify, you give them the loans, they keep paying. So nobody kind of connected the dot that systemically, as the whole economy, it can only feed exactly until you run out of the lowest income group to feed your queue, right?
Mhm.
Once you lend to strippers, that there is nobody else. That's it.
Right.
And by the way, like I say this anecdote to people, like that's how you kind of predict exactly the pops of the bubbles. In my company, I heard, I think it was 2017, when people in the kitchen started talking about Bitcoin. I said that's the moment the bubble pops. It was insane. Literally, it popped the next week. This was the peak before the current peak. I
Mhm.
think this was like 2017. We're in end of 17. Literally, I said people in the kitchen are talking about getting into Bitcoin.
Right.
There is nobody else. That's the end of the bubble, right?
Right.
So I think the bankers, like, okay, they seem smart, but systemically I don't think a lot of people understood that this is this has to end. Mainstream economics wasn't a help here. They don't have the notion of a bubble. They don't have the financial system in their models. Like, they don't have private debt. Like, they can yap about the government going bankrupt. They do it all the time. At the same time, the private sector has debt 3 times the size, and there's zero notion of like how are they financing the interest payments.
Gotcha. And so I guess from there, I kind of want to shift and talk. I mean, you mentioned Alan Greenspan during, when he was at the Fed and kind of setting the stage for the 2008 financial crisis. That's kind of what I wanted to shift to next here. So in the one kind of post I saw you had, it was, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, government deficits equal private sector surplus. That's why every time the U.S. tried to reduce the national debt, a depression followed. What do you have to say? And this will kind of get into the conversation about the Great Recession. What do you have to say to the people that say, well, trying to reduce the national debt is not what leads to the depression recession, it's other factors. So like for example, during Bill Clinton's time, right? Like he balanced the budget. He started running a surplus and we saw an economic boom. But and then I'm sure you're going to respond with, well, 2001, right? The bubble burst. But what do you have to say to people that say, well, it's not trying to reduce the debt or balance the budget, it's other factors that are leading to like the recession that's incoming?
I mean, like, obviously we can discuss. There's definitely other factors, and to be honest, this slide that I share, it's about 19th century mostly,
Okay.
when the government, I feel like it was too small to cause recessions by tightening fiscal policy. It's still uncanny, and I'm just saying it's mathematically true. When the banker in the monopoly game has a surplus, the
Mhm.
players have a deficit. It's true. And does it help the economy? It can only help the economy if it's overheated. If you have insane bubble, everybody's employed, companies are running out of productive capacity. Yeah, that's the moment you want to destroy the surplus of the private sector. It may help, it may cool things down. But otherwise, if people are struggling, let's say the government had a surplus in 2006.
Okay.
or 7 or 8. It means not only our housing wealth is going up in smoke, we are having to send checks to the government. Our balances in banks are running down because we have a deficit and the government just writes more digits in its Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't even get anything out of that. It's the arbiter of the dollar system, right? Like the banker in the monopoly game. So like it's a Twitter slide. Yeah, no, I don't feel like, every depression in history was caused by government surplus, but it just says don't cheer surpluses for the sake of them being surpluses, right? It's
Mhm.
just cheering on the surplus of the banker and monopoly game. Like, nobody should be cheering on this. It's
Right.
irrelevant at the very least, maybe harmful.
I would say that the cheering on of a surplus at that time had less to do with we're so happy the government's running a surplus and more to do with the fact of, our national debt had kind of been running wild up until the 90s, really, with major deficits in the 80s and the
Mhm.
70s. And I think that for me, I look at it and it's like, okay, from maybe the libertarian type perspective, it's like if you aren't printing money, like you aren't going to have the inflation that's destroying working class and middle class people. And you already hinted at that inflation is a problem. Now, this is where I kind of want to discuss something a little bit different. A lot of times when people talk about inflation, they're like, oh, well, the price of goods and services is going up. When you go to the grocery store, you're seeing bananas that are, 50% more from a year ago. I'm just saying a hypothetical scenario. However, there's a difference between asset inflation and price inflation, right? And that was something that, like, from 2000 to 2008 and after that, the government was really looking at, and the Fed, right? When Alan Greenspan had rates at like 1% forever, we had no price inflation. It was like, well, don't stop the stock market. Who cares about asset inflation? Like, the economy's booming, right? But in reality, when the stock market's booming, we start creating massive wealth inequality, and then you start seeing social tensions. And then that's why I kind of think too, like during the COVID times when we started printing out these stimulus checks, when we printed out stimulus checks and gave, $1,200 to households and individuals, that's what created a lot of the inflation. And I will give you that it was other supply chain issues as well. But that's what created a lot of the inflation that we saw price wise during that time and asset wise. I mean, and right now it's like, yeah, we don't see the same inflation that we saw maybe 4 years ago, but we still are having massive asset inflation. So I kind of want to get your opinion on asset inflation versus price inflation. And do you think that I'm totally off there and kind of what I just said?
I mean, I would push back on the fact that, those $1,200 checks cause inflation because how do we, like, if we look at the long term uh, graph of deficits and inflation in any economy you can pick. Like I looked at US, UK, Japan. Is there a correlation between government deficit, which as we know is the surplus of the private sector? This is exactly what is pushing money into the board. We do expect this correlation, right? The more deficit, the more money in the private sector, the higher inflation.
Mhm.
Look at those graphs. You won't see anything. Not only that, the correlation is actually negative. Negative. Not plus 100%, it's negative. How
Mhm.
can it be? I think it can be because we have, since at least, the 70s, decent unemployment. We have slack in the economy. We have output gaps, so spare capacity. And the government pushes a ton of money into the economy, runs a huge deficit when there is a recession. Recession means people are hit, they don't spend, and so on and so on. Okay, so over time, there is no correlation. How about this last episode, the COVID? How to compare it? We have one event, right? A ton of
Mhm.
money and a ton of inflation. Was the
Right.
inflation caused by money? Here I would look at, and people did, right? Across different economies. Did the economy that injected more have more inflation? No. Actually, again, the correlation is not there. And, I'm from Eastern Europe. So I looked at Eastern European situation and it was uncanny. Eastern Europe had a lot higher inflation than Western Europe. And people said, oh, because you don't have euro and your central bank is so bad. Even the countries on the euro in Eastern Europe, like Estonia, Lithuania, Slovakia, they had identical inflation to like Poland, Romania, and Czech Republic with their own currencies.
Mhm.
Identical. How can it be? Why Estonia, with the same central bank, the ECB, has 20% inflation? And France has at the same time 5% inflation. How can it be? And people notice that inflation didn't correlate with like deficits, money supply, anything of this size or type. it correlated with the so-called energy intensity of the economy. Those Eastern economies, they are less efficient. They burn a lot more calories to produce €1 of GDP. So, less efficient transportation, everything. And the economies, producing cement rather than computer chips, right? So it uses a lot more energy. Those guys, and the correlation was there. The higher energy intensity. And the funny part was, okay, there is one economy with high energy intensity, which is Iceland. They use a ton of energy, but guess what? It's geothermal, is their own. They didn't have inflation. They didn't need to buy expensive oil. So I would kind of push back. And, you said, I agree with you, asset bubbles and protecting asset prices drives inequality. But notice that those $1,200 checks, this caused this last recession and coming out of this recession to be an exception to the rule. For a longer time, lower income households have their income growing faster than higher income households. That was great. They got money for nothing. They started quitting McDonald's. McDonald's had to raise lowest wages.
Are you
This,
saying
this
that
was the
because of the stimulus checks?
Yeah, I think this was the bailout of the Main Street for once. That's great.
Sure, and I guess I would say there too, but I think you gotta push back a little bit. I mean, those stimulus checks would have, 1, never come if we didn't shut the country down because of the pandemic, and 2, I mean, you think that getting 1 or 2, $1,200 checks is gonna be like, "Well, I can quit my job now." I think that it was a little bit more than that, and I wanna kinda go back. You talked about, comparison between Western Europe and Eastern Europe in terms of maybe production capacity or, the way they use energy. If US is really efficient, we still had high inflation, and if we still have a lot of production capacity and like that. So if the printing of the money and the stimulus checks didn't attribute to the inflation, what did? Like
Uh,
you're saying, like during the time you're comparing Eastern Europe to Western Europe and these other different countries, but what was making, one country have 20% inflation versus 5%? Why isn't it 1 and 2%?
because like what happened there is you can do another comparison: import goods versus local produced goods, and services versus exactly manufactured goods, right? In US, again, the difference was huge. Imported goods started being expensive because the ports were shut down and so on and so on. So you had the disconnect. So if you think it's money supply, why on not services, only goods, and not all the goods, just imported goods are getting more expensive?
Yeah, I
That's
would
kind of
agree.
not.
I agree there, and I think too, like that goes back. It's like inflation can be caused by a multitude of factors. One being like supply chain issues, like you
Yeah.
said. And I would say though too, like I've always understood inflation as too much money chasing too few goods. So if you're having supply chain issues
Yeah.
and goods are scarce,
Mhm.
and you're printing trillions of dollars to give to cash to individuals in the country, that's going to, increase inflation significantly versus having, say, because, just in case we're just running deficits, you're like, well, the government runs massive deficits when we're in a recession. The government runs massive deficits all the time. Like we're continually running the same deficits whether we're in a recession or not. So I think that there's many factors, but the fact that we print money and we're giving it out to citizens certainly increase the rate of inflation.
Maybe in a tiny amount, because like again, if you look at this productive capacity and the capacity utilization,
Hmm.
we didn't even come close to the 2019 levels,
Hmm.
and the inflation was already a lot higher.
Yeah.
So it's not like, okay, we run at 80% capacity, we give money to people, and we start running at 98% capacity, and then bottlenecks all over the place and inflation from demand. I would agree. But we actually only came back to the pre-COVID capacity utilization in
Hmm.
Eastern Europe, in US. And the graph of inflation, once it was, because inflation is one index, but you can look inside. What is driving the CPI increase? And that's also a graph that I'm plastering all over Twitter. It's insane how few factors drove the inflation. At some point, okay, oil got expensive. And I actually looked from the inside of a financial company that predicted that the energy prices in US are gonna go up despite the fact that demand for energy in 2021 was still lower than in 2019. Why? We shut down oil wells in the COVID. Once you shut down oil wells, also gas wells are shut down. So
Yep.
then you only start buying as much gas as before. It's more expensive. Oil
Right.
in the markets, it's more expensive, even before the war in Ukraine. So that's what happened. And then there were some issues with chips, which also wasn't because of printing money. So at some point, used cars caused like 40% of the rise in inflation in US. That's insane. And
Yeah.
you have noticed probably what happened to the prices of used cars. So why did the money that was printed only go to used cars or buying energy? Like, to me, feel it wouldn't be worth it if we didn't send those checks and inflation was like 0.5% lower, but you would have like mass unemployment. It wouldn't be worth it, I would think.
Okay. All right, I can definitely understand that where you're coming from there and understand that take. I want to now shift a little bit. I have a few more questions for you. Talk about inflation. You kind of mentioned the importance of the stimulus checks and how that helped Main Street America, right? Where I was kind of making the argument that the inflation is hollowing out the middle class and destroying purchasing power of the working class people in this country. During the 4 years of the Biden presidency, also, I just want to say for anyone that listens to this, inflation makes a president very unpopular.
Hmm.
Most of the time, it's not Joe Biden's fault that we had record high inflation, or it wasn't Jimmy Carter's fault
Yep.
necessarily that we had. It just makes the president really unpopular. And it's like, it is what it is. That's just how the world works right now. However, during the Biden administration, during those 4 years, inflation was like 20%, right? Across those 4 years. It averaged like 4.9% or something like that every month or year over year, whatever it was. However, so essentially what I'm saying is, if after those 4 years, if inflation's been 20%, if you're a working person in America, if you did not get a 20% raise on your income or your salary, you are doing worse off. You have less purchasing power. So that to me is a major problem. Like, what's the answer to that? Give people more money, print more money and give it to people? Because I have a problem with that, especially if you're working. You maybe get a 2% raise every year, right? Like, maybe, like, that's normally like the standard. It's like you needed to be getting a 20% raise over 4 years. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
what do
yeah,
you have to
absolutely.
say to that argument?
I mean, I look at the data, right? And
Hmm.
when you look at the data, it's kind of crazy. The wages grew too. There is no inflation without rising wages. And if you divide the wages by the price level in 2020, let's say 4, and 2019, the 2024, the ratio is higher. So despite all this inflation, on average, but it's on average, that's the problem, right? On average, wages were higher. So people didn't lose. And, in Eastern Europe, where I looked, like inflation at some point peaked at 20%. And still people were better off in 2024 than 2019. So, but a lot of people are getting hurt. So when I look at the wage graph, it's steeper than prices graph, but it's obvious that it's not for everybody. Not everybody got the 20% raise, right? So
Yeah, like
inflation,
nobody did. Like, and that's kind
I
of
have to disagree because, you cannot get the mean to be higher with nobody getting a raise. Somebody got a raise. Somebody got 40%. That's the problem. Somebody got.
okay. I see what you, yeah, but like, see, that's it was the CEO of, some tech company or whatever. That's kind of like why it's like, well, if this wasn't a problem and you're like trying, not everyone got the same raise. You're right, but that's kind of like part of the pain points for like middle America and working class America is they're not getting these raises and they're the ones that really need it.
I think, again, statistically, this recession was special. I hate to see in most recessions, rich people bounce back a lot faster. This
Hmm.
is what happened in, Obama bounced back and like all the other previous bounce backs in the 20th century. This recession was special.
Hmm.
For a longer time, like couple of years, lowest incomes actually grew faster than top incomes. So if average income grew faster than prices, lowest income had to grow faster than prices.
Hmm.
But, I think there is also the effect that, it's called Murphy's Law, right? Like if you stand in the line at the supermarket, you only notice when the other line goes faster. You never notice when your line goes faster. Then you're like, yeah, that's what's supposed to be, right? When the other guys are moving faster, you notice. So inflation is, this belies the fact that like people say, oh, inflation helps the government. No, inflation gives nothing to the government. They have the same power to print money. They didn't destroy their debt stocks or whatever. They don't care. They issue dollars, they issue bonds. They don't care about inflation. They are hurt by inflation because people who see the other line moving faster, I got 2% raise, prices went up 20%. Those people are pissed more than the other people are happy.
Right.
That's why inflation hurts the government, and a ton of governments across the board, they lost power after this inflation episode, right? Like in France, they got battered. In England, they lost power. In Poland, they lost power. In US,
Right.
Biden lost.
Yep.
Everybody kind of lost.
Hmm.
Nobody survived this inflation. So I agree with the sentiment, but like if you look at prices and wages actually kept up or even exceeded the price rise on average. So that's hard
See,
to believe. I know
after
you.
this, yeah, I mean, it's tough because it's hard for me to. I would want to see this graph, like this data.
Let's talk on Twitter.
Yeah, yeah. I'll have to take a look at just it's because it's hard for me to picture that because if that was the case, then why is inflation such a concern to so many people, right? Because it's like if you're doing better off, like your wage, if most people are doing better off, wages are increasing like faster than prices, then like inflation wouldn't be a major concern. That wouldn't have been a major factor for people like in the last election.
I mean, I think this again is this effect when the gas price goes from like $2.5 to $3.5. You
Yep.
notice, right? But then when it
Exactly.
goes from 3.5 to 2.5, you're like, yeah, whatever. It came back to where it was supposed to be. Although over time, this $2.5 is actually cheaper than $2.5 20 years ago, right? But you just take it for granted and you're like, okay, nothing happens. When egg prices rise, you notice. When they go down, you don't notice. So I think
Okay.
it's kind of a lot of psychology. I feel like it's that.
All right, that's fair. Shift off here. A couple more questions for you before I let you go. First one is kind of what made you come to this conclusion of, fiat and deficits being good? And I guess what are the pros in your mind, the big pros of the fiat system?
Yeah, I basically started looking into economics. I studied economics at some point. Never finished. I went to physics and graduated in physics. I kind of came back to economics after 2008. I was shocked that nobody predicted this, nobody warned against this. And then I looked at the list of people who supposedly predicted the crisis,
Hmm.
and the lists were ridiculous. There was like 5 names. Five in a profession which has like 500,000 people working in macroeconomics. 5 people predicted that something bad might happen. So then I started, reading some of those people's, those five, and one of them was Steve Keen, right? This Australian guy who is also on Twitter, and I recommend him. To me, he is not like ideal and definitely not at the time. A lot of confusion there, but like some of his posts in blogs like blew my mind. Like the first time I've seen this graph of private debt versus public debt, like it blew my mind. Like I've been hearing about public debt and bankruptcy of the country forever. All of a sudden, private debt is 5 times higher or 3 times higher. And it actually corresponds, the spikes in this correspond to depressions. You have a spike of private debt in the Great Depression, and then a collapse because people retrench. Then you have a spike in the private debt in 2008 Great Recession, and then you have a drop off because people retrench, right? So it looks like the private debt drives the economy more than the public debt. Private sector can go bankrupt. After reading Steve Keen, I basically stumbled upon this debate between Keen and the so-called MMT, modern monetary theory.
Well, would you define yourself as
Yeah,
a
yeah,
subscriber to
yeah.
the
I,
MMT?
I'm a fan of MMT. Feel like they have a lot of things right. I mean, it's not the theory of everything, but you kind of want to know it
Mhm.
to jive with the other things. And like what struck me in this debate is that, for me, previously economics was a lot of this hand waving and, like graphs coming out of nowhere, two intersecting stakes and a lot of ideology and, blind spots and so on. Those
Mhm.
guys could basically describe every transaction like, okay, I buy carrots from you, I get a loan from a bank, into exactly asset impacts, liability impacts, who got what, how the balance sheets changed. I noticed that they have something figured out. And then I started reading those blogs. To be honest, this, identity, accounting identity, that the government deficit is the private sector surplus. Once you
Okay.
see it, you cannot unsee it. And it's so shocking because we are told something else, right? We are told that those deficits are necessarily bad. Once you see this, okay, they may be neutral or may be good sometimes, right? It shocks you. And the funny part is, it's not some kind of crazy theory that they cooked up. It's just an accounting identity. And it's actually in economics textbooks. Like it is in mainstream textbooks because it has to be. It's math. It's just something that they don't stress and kind of don't follow up on and don't build on.
So would you say that the flexibility of a fiat system is like the biggest pros of it, or what are your
I
thoughts
think
there?
I think we do need the flexibility because I think people tend to think that it's just an assumption we have in the back of our mind that the economy is like stable, has stable amount of goods. US economy is, I think, in real terms, like, I don't know, 7 times larger or 10 times larger than during the Second World War.
Mm,
10 times larger. So you kind of need 10 times more money in it, right? What if the supply of yellow rocks or whatever your money is constrained and it can only grow 3 times? I feel that this may be a problem. So to me, flexibility is valuable.
mhm.
Obviously, you can mess it up. You can reward your friends. You can bail out banks and not Main Street. You can
Yeah.
do a lot of damage as with any technology. But I feel like it's a technology we need to understand.
Okay. That makes sense, and I respect that, opinion. I think for me, like when I look at it, I read a book a while back and it talked about MMT, modern
Mhm.
monetary theory, and I was like, well, it kind of made sense to me at the time. But then, and I know you're gonna see the graph that I'm talking about. Have you ever seen the graph of like the purchasing power of the dollar, like
Yeah,
over the years?
yeah, collapse.
I saw that graph and I'm like, "Man," and then that kinda what's got me to go down like that a little bit of a rabbit hole more on like the Austrian
Mhm.
side of sound money, and I've like, well, that makes a lot more sense to me and seems a lot more responsible because to me, it's like, what do you say to like, well, is the government just supposed to run a deficit forever? The debt can go up as much? I mean, has there ever been a currency in history where the government's been able to, run deficits, print money, print digits, however you wanna say it, endlessly? Like, has that ever been a scenario?
I think, I mean, US is an example, right? Like the US has been running deficits for 200 years. And it's running higher and higher deficits. Like I read left-leaning economists in the thousands who told me that Bush is gonna bankrupt the country by doing the war in Iraq. Like we are out of money. Social security is gonna be cut before the decade is over. None of this happened, right? They had the money, unfortunately. They had capacity to wage this war.
Mhm.
Um, so, and then, this graph about purchasing power. This graph doesn't have wages. It assumes you make $1 in 1913 and you spend this dollar in 2005. It doesn't tell you how many dollars you make in 2025 compared to
Okay,
2000.
that's true.
Actually, the hour of labor makes you a lot more now than then. And why
Sure,
is
okay,
that?
that's fair.
Also because there is full employment. You don't need to compete with 20 people for a job. And this flexibility, the US only used it for good in the Second World War. Like first
Mhm.
the depression happened, they had 35% unemployment. People were just staring at this, nothing we can do. Some stupid ideas were tried. Roosevelt tried to, I don't know, confiscate crops so that prices don't fall. He didn't
Yeah,
understand that we actually do need the crops, but we also do need the farmers' incomes not to fall because farmers spend money, they give jobs to people who sell them the goods, right?
right.
So, and then the government was forced to abandon all the constraints because the war started. They increased the national debt by a factor of 5 during the war. 5. So when we talk about $37 trillion, think about $180 trillion in 5 years. That's what happened then. And since then, it increased 1,000 times. 1,000 times. Think about this. So, like, if I told you, okay, not $37 trillion, $37 quadrillion, it's gonna happen. Maybe
When you
not.
tell me wait, but when you say that to me, that means, like to me, I'm like, the dollar is just no one's gonna want it. Like, that would be the argument, and this is kinda like my next question for you is, like, do you believe in Bitcoin or owning gold or anything like that? Like, what do people do to save their purchasing power?
I believe in anything you can, like, nobody tells you to be in dollars, right? To me, you have the right to change every dollar you make into gold or Bitcoin, do whatever works for you. but I don't feel like the dollar is gonna go away. Like people think, and I think that's the weakness of this movement, right? That this dollar, like, is gonna poof collapse one day. Nobody wants it. Those guys don't appreciate the power of the government to, unfortunately, enforce dollars by this tax obligation. And
Yeah.
if you told somebody in 1930 that US national debt is gonna go up 1,000 times over the next 90 years, they would say, okay, it's the dollar's worthless, the economy collapsed, nobody wants dollars. It was replaced by yen, renminbi, God knows what, right? No,
Yeah.
it didn't happen. Wages are still in real terms higher. US has bond auctions that are 3 times oversubscribed. People kill other people to get dollars. Dollars are in demand. So I think, like it's hard to kind of fathom exponential growth. The economy grows 3% a year.
Mm.
Population still increases in the US and prices increase 3% a year. So you may have like 6% a year growth in the nominal economy. Take 6% growth over 100 years. You're gonna get some serious increase, like 10 times whatever. So the debt is gonna increase multiples. Prices are gonna increase. Wages are gonna increase. I don't feel like the US dollar is gonna go away. But it doesn't mean you need to use, dollars to store value. To
Hmm.
be honest, like the dollar, what is the dollar from the point of view of the issuer? It's a tool to do what? To reorganize the economy, to say, I want to build a highway, I want to stock the army, I want to pay pensions. It's not a vehicle for rich people to save money. The government doesn't go to all those lengths to say, here is a risk free bank account that completely isolates you from the problems in the economy.
Yeah.
Hey, Rothschilds, here is a bank account for you. You can just put all your wealth in this and we're going to protect this. That's not why the dollars are issued. So,
I get that, but then that would be like for me, for like, regular working class Americans who are trying to like do the right thing and save money. Like I know that it's not like we're going to protect your dollar here, but like what happens if they don't know like how to, properly invest or, I don't know, like would you recommend that people are buying gold or Bitcoin or something like that? I mean, that's a problem I have is I know the dollar isn't, set out to help people, save their wealth over time, but like you're robbing people blind who aren't like educated enough to know how to do some of these things.
I mean, with this, I kind of agree, right? Like the poor have a hard time saving because, yeah, they are inclined to save in dollars, and the dollars are not a great saving instrument. If you look over time, there is this fancy graph. Actually, over time, it's just historical record over the last 100 years, so it's not a proof of everything.
Mhm.
But actually, if you invested in bonds, you would get more than if you invested in gold over
Okay.
that period of time. So, bonds are a way. It's still not a solution because, like poor people don't buy bonds, right? Would I recommend gold or Bitcoin? I mean, to me, I am scared of the volatility. I
Do you believe in Bitcoin?
I don't believe in Bitcoin as a systemic solution,
Okay,
right?
but do you believe it as like an asset?
I think it's a super risky asset. I don't own Bitcoin, to be
Okay.
honest. And I would have a hard time telling some poor person to buy Bitcoin because it may go up 3 times, it may go down 10 times. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't believe in it enough to recommend it.
Okay.
Definitely wouldn't. I think volatility is insane. If you annualize this volatility, like it's like if you think about this collapsing purchasing power of the dollar over 100 years, it lost 98%.
Mhm.
If you annualize some of the swings in Bitcoin, like they would absolutely dwarf what happened to the dollar. But then, it bounces back, right?
Right.
I don't know. If I knew where it goes, like to me, Bitcoin is not like dollar because again, nothing stands behind it, right? If there was a Yakuza in Japan, right? A mafia in Japan or some other country that says, if you don't bring us Bitcoin at the end of the year, we are gonna chop off your pinky. And if they have enough power in this society, they can drive the demand for Bitcoin and it would be stable the same way as the government drives the demand for dollars.
Yeah.
But I feel now that Bitcoin is literally like, it's like a Pokemon card for adults. Like if the mood changes, people may go into something else. I
Mhm.
don't see any rock on which Bitcoin rests. Just because it's finite, to me, it's not enough.
Okay.
Because, yeah, there is a lot of
Okay.
finite stuff, you know? So I'm not like a Bitcoin believer, as you can hear.
Yeah. No, I get it. It makes sense. I guess last question I have for you here is if someone wanted to learn more about fiat money, MMT, do you have maybe 3 book recommendations you can leave my
Yeah.
audience?
Yeah, sure. Not sure if three, but there's definitely The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton.
Deficit myth.
Yeah, it came out in 2020, I think. It's a very nice, popular book. And it's like high up in the bestseller list of New York Times. It has been popular. It's great. There is the book by Warren Mosler, who is like the creator of the I think it's called Seven Deadly Frauds of Economics Policy. And it's much shorter, it's easier. It's like literally those 7 chapters where he talks about like major blunders people make, like popular
Mhm.
myths. So I think it's great. What else would I recommend? I mean, I would, for example, recommend reading the book Crashed, I think, by Adam Tooze about the 2008 economic crisis, like when like it shows you like who was risking whom. Like obviously the Fed and the government was risking the private sector versus the other way around. Another great book by Adam Tooze, like the same guy, is The Economy of Destruction, or Wages of Destruction. Sorry, Wages of Destruction. It's kind of a weird title. It's
The
about,
wages of destruction.
yeah, Wages of Destruction. It's about the economy of the Third Reich. And then it shows like they never ran out of money, but they were definitely resource constrained. So I think it's kind of shows you what the constraints of the economy are, because they literally squeezed the last juices of their productive capacity. Never had a money problem, but they had a huge resource problem. So
Okay, awesome. I love those recommendations. I'm going to put the links to those in the description. But again, I just want to thank you so much for coming on. This was an awesome conversation. I really appreciate it. And I hope we can do it again sometime.
yeah, thank you so much. Like you're a great interviewer. So
Thank you. I
looking
appreciate
forward.
that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.